Well, there we are, top of the hour. Good evening, everybody. First, just for everyone's awareness, we are recording this session. A copy is going to be made available for those who are unable to attend live. Next, for the format of tonight's meeting, I'm going to start by introducing our guest, who will describe his connection to unmanned system technology. Afterwards, I'm going to lead a series of introductory questions, which we will then open up to a class-wide Q&A session. I ask that you all mute your mics and save all your questions to the end, and that you use the hand raise icon to indicate when you do have a question. I'll call on each of you in order, and I also want to note that I'll be capturing and sharing online links to important concepts, details, and tools that are brought up in tonight's discussion. You're going to be able to find these in the video notes or in the discussion area tomorrow. So I am thrilled to welcome you to the 17th session of the UNSY Guest SME Speaker Series. I'm Dr. Brent Terwilliger, the Program Coordinator for the Master of Science in Unmanned Systems degree. Tonight, we are joined by our guest subject matter expert, Brad Hayden, the founder and CEO of RoboticSkies. Little background about Brad. He grew up in the aviation industry, working from a young age in his family's avionics sale and service business. After graduating from the University of Utah, he left the aviation industry to launch his career managing global high-tech marketing programs for companies such as US Robotics, 3Com, Informix, and EFI. Brad returned to aviation as one of the original executives of Aspen Avionics, a venture-backed cockpit display manufacturer, where he was responsible for creating and building the company's brand and product strategy. He led the definition and rollout of Aspen's avionics groundbreaking connected panel product line, which has revolutionized the synchronization of data in the cockpit. A certificated private pilot and avid drone pilot, Brad advocates for the safe integration of next-gen aircraft into existing global flight operations through various industry efforts. In January 2021, Brad received an appointment to a seat on the FAA's Advanced Aviation Advisory Committee. Now, I met Brad back in spring of 2015 when we both spoke about UAS at the National Business Aviation Association's Business Aviation Management Committee Leadership Conference, which was in Tucson, Arizona. Back then, it was just very plain to see how impactful this technology would become. And now it's just starting to realize the maturation of it. Brad now chairs the NBAA Emerging Technology Committee, as well as the ASTM Subcommittee F46.06 on autonomous and electric aircraft maintenance personnel. With that, I'd like to turn the stage over to Brad so he can just tell us a little bit about RoboticSkies, his personal experience, as well as observations associated with this rapidly changing technology.
Well, thanks, Brent. It's great to be here. And as Brent says, he and I go a ways back now in industry advocacy. And it's really thrilling to be here with one of his classes and be able to talk to you all a little bit. I'm really honored to be here with you today. So especially talking to a new generation. And, that's what I'm going to talk to you. I'm assuming everybody's pretty much at the beginning of your careers. And, you're at that point where you're figuring out where you're going to go, where you want to start to take your career. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my background. Brent covered a good deal of it, but mostly around when I started this company, RoboticSkies, how I got there. And some of the decisions I made to start the company, because I think a little entrepreneurism might be interesting to you as well, because I believe there's a CEO in everybody. And there's an entrepreneur in a lot of you as well. So at any rate, as I talk to my story, I think it's interesting to see how people's lives and careers kind of weave together to form really a theme, if you will, throughout your entire career. And I'm going to encourage you to follow that theme very much. And you're going to have a lot of decision points in your career where maybe you don't know if you're going the right direction or whatever. I want you to have faith in yourselves as we discuss that. And so you get a little bit of that in my story, and goodness knows my story is not over. Got a lot left to go, but nonetheless, I think it's interesting as it's grown alongside this emerging market. And it's really great to be talking through the latest generation in aviation. And you have a lot of reasons why this is a very unique time for people entering the aviation space. And it's not just the changes in technology that we're seeing today. And we are seeing a whole bunch of changes, from somebody, kind of coming into it in the beginning, as you might be right now. You may not realize, as Brent and I do, just how much the industry has changed just in the last few years. And it's accelerating, I would say. And Brent's nodding his head, so I'm assuming he agrees. It's a wild ride, especially if you decide to ride on the wild edge. And so you'll hear me talk about what I refer to as traditional aviation, which is, flying people from point A to point B. We're talking about, general aviation, business aviation, et cetera. And then there's what I call next gen aviation, which is really around, uncrewed aircraft, as well as advanced air mobility aircraft. So I'm going to apologize in advance real quick, by the way. I'm in a hotel room in DC right now, and not at home in my home office. And so I hope this hotel internet holds up. And that is not my real view behind me. I don't think that's something you'd want to see. So at any rate, though, why I'm excited again to be talking to you is not just the changes in tech, but also the changes in perceptions. And that's incredibly important. And I'm going to talk more about that here later. But basically, the industry is changing from the inside out. And we're seeing that around many different things, which I'll touch on, particularly around workforce development. And so very, very exciting times. So as Brent said, he kind of read through my bio. Grew up working on airplanes. As soon as I got out of college, I ran as far away from the family business as I could, ended up in marketing. Always liked to, do new things. And so was very much drawn back to the web development. I'm going to kind of date myself here, but suffice to say that I got into web way early on. Let's see, I think Microsoft was about a 10-page website, I think, whenever I built my first corporate website. But really was on, again, the leading edge of technology in that regard, and a lot of marketing, things like that. Did that for quite a few years, but, once aviation gets in your blood, you can't stay away from it. And I ended up coming back into aerospace for a company that was a startup company, which is where I got a lot of my startup experience. And it was a flight display company. It's still around, Aspen Avionics, make flight displays for Part 23 aircraft. Did a lot of the work like what Brent's talking about. First of all, invented the company basically with the founders, and then launched it formally, and then came out with products, including what we call connected panel. And this is interesting because connected panel, as Brent said, it really did revolutionize data in the cockpit. Believe it or not, there was a day when people weren't used to bringing iPads, for example, into an aircraft to actually do flight planning. It was not a thing because there were no iPads until, call it the early 2010s. And so we saw it where I sat in an avionics company as a threat, because we were selling these flight displays that we wanted people to install. And suddenly, instead of installing these flight displays that we were selling, people were bringing their iPads into the cockpit, and they were flying things called ForeFlight, which was a whole brand new product nobody had ever heard of. And I knew Tyson. I had the opportunity to meet him back when he was Tyson Wise, the founder and CEO, and he's still selling a weather product. And, we were looking at that and really had the notion, hey, why do we need to bring in this whole disjointed product like this flight planning tool in the form of an iPad? And it's not linked up with the rest of your cockpit. And that was like a foreign, real, unique idea. And so we figured out how to actually bring that data that's coming in the iPad, the flight planning data, into the backside of the cockpit. So you had certified and uncertified data. What does all that mean? And this data is really, in my mind, and this whole move towards data is something that happened over the last, now 25 years in aerospace where you've taken an analog environment where the pieces don't know what the other pieces are doing, and we've really translated that, or we've grown that into a a more dynamic digital environment, which is what we see now, and it has applicability because that's what we see in next gen aircraft. So whereas you have like this whole legacy fleet of analog aircraft, next generation aircraft were born in digital technology, and so they understand basically forms this great foundation to be able to capture all this data that's going on all the time. And how can we make our aircraft more efficient, and how can we make them fly better, and how can we maintain them better? All these things are based on the data that we're starting to gather. So see, this even started when we're talking next gen aircraft prior to really when we started to see drones really emerging, because we were founding this new digital foundation, if you will, even for the legacy aircraft. And these are aircraft that have been flying for 40 years. And we're suddenly, installing this type of technology. So at any rate, in addition to being a manned pilot, as Brent mentioned, I started flying FPV drones back before you could really buy an FPV drone. You literally had to download the plans from the internet. Now it sounds like I'm probably making a bomb or something, but download the plans, and then you would have to go out and buy all the parts, try to get them, order a lot of them from China, et cetera, put them together. And I was just fascinated by it, and ended up, crashing a lot of them, but learned a lot at the same time. And, really when I looked at where this was going to go, these new type of aircraft, I just saw limitless possibilities with where this could end up. And so, I started doing a lot of research, and a lot of being a marketing guy, started doing a lot of really analysis on where this could end up. And really what I came up with were just a few things. One was that, of course, this was going to be a disruptor to aerospace as it is. I saw it as being the biggest disruptor to aviation really since the jet engine. And aviation, I should add, is a really tough industry to disrupt because we are so safety based that we don't want new things. We want to do the same thing over and over again and do it safely. And so when you start talking about disrupting an industry, it gets very interesting, and then maybe that's something Brent and I can talk about here in a little bit. But it's a whole thing when you start taking a safety-based industry and telling it to do something different that may not be perceived as safe as what they're doing today. Also, is going to be global. That this was not going to be a regional phenomenon. This was going to be a global phenomenon. And that's absolutely what we're seeing play out today. I have not met a drone company or an advanced aviation mobility company that has aspirations to sell into Canada or into Europe. They want to sell all over the world. So this is definitely something that's opening up at a global level for these companies as well. Also, that drones would get bigger. There's an old saying in aerospace that planes just get bigger, and that applies over to drones as well. I remember Brent and I talking about that back in the day, that, hey, we got to get ready for these things to get big and start flying more complex missions. And that's absolutely, of course, what we're seeing happen today. And then finally, and this is where it gets really interesting, is that you started seeing they were non-aviation companies coming into the space. Aviation was a little late to the game on this. It was really being led by high-tech companies that were, in fact, taking this space over by storm. In fact, back in the day, again, Brent and I were trying to, educate flight departments, corporate flight departments, on how to utilize this technology. And they just kind of weren't having it. And, it was kind of like 7 stages of death type thing. They were just like, this isn't going to happen. It was denial. We're not going to deal with this. And we just couldn't get them there. And what ended up happening way early on, much to our frustration, was that the flight departments didn't pick it up. It ended up going into the IT department. And so you saw drones flying and managed by the IT departments. And so it was a very interesting time in that regard. And I think is very symbolic of kind of the tech versus aviation phenomenon that we saw very early on in this the whole advancement of this market. So, when I started looking at all these different things, again, that these drones are going to get bigger, they're going to fly more complex missions, that they're global, et cetera. One of the things that I determined was that somebody was going to have to maintain these things, and they weren't going to be able to maintain them by just shipping them into the factory for repair, because they're going to get too big, they're going to be too complex, and they needed to be repaired right there where they were operating. And so I started thinking about how this could be done in the current aviation infrastructure that we have today, knowing that these aircraft were going to be regulated, just like we see, traditional aircraft regulated. And that, of course, is what's come to pass as well. So what I did, and this is something that I think is very successful for a company, and I also think that it's something that investors really enjoy putting money into, is the concept of taking something that's old, that already exists, and then putting a new spin on it, so that you can actually leverage the infrastructure that's already there without having to reinvent everything, but putting a new spin on it to take advantage of the type of product or the type of service that you're offering. So in this case, what I did was formed RoboticSkies, which is a company that is basically provides global maintenance services to drone and advanced aviation aircraft. And I'm talking about very sophisticated drones, by the way, like drone delivery, things like that, around the world. And we do that through our service center network, which is actually existing MROs, maintenance, repair, overhaul facilities, or Part 145 repair stations. And the way that we do it is, we as RoboticSkies, we partner with the OEMs. Bear in mind, a lot of them don't have any aviation experience at all. They don't know what it means to have to come up with a scheduled and unscheduled maintenance program for these type of aircraft. And we will go and develop their maintenance program with them, and then we implement it in the field through our service center network. We manage all the work. We manage the workflow, we manage the scheduling, everything, and we also manage the billing, and that's when we make our money, is when we get paid whenever these aircraft are repaired. So again, it's taking that layer that already exists and then putting like this global spin on it, this centralized spin on it, so that the customer only has to work with one contact, as opposed to having to work with each one of these MROs or set up their own MRO network, which is very laborious and takes a lot of time and money. And so we basically hold a niche spot in the market, where we are providing these services that are needed. And I will add, it's taken some time to get here, because drones have taken a long time to start to get any kind of traction, really meaningful traction in the market, but we provide those maintenance services. And if you think about it too, maintenance is not the most exciting part of aerospace, but I will just add that when you look at where next generation aircraft are going, we're talking, some of the things that you'll be dealing with, like autonomy. We're talking about, no pilot in the cockpit. Suddenly you're not going to have the pilot that's out there that's actually, managing everything and making sure that everybody's in their seats and that kind of thing. It's going to be conducted by a crew where basically everybody's equal. The pilot's like sitting behind a computer and they're, putting in waypoints, and you've got your crew that's out there, making sure that the aircraft are ready to fly and things like that. And so it's really setting, and it's kind of what I was talking to earlier, setting this new tone of what we're going to see for crews for these next generation aircraft. And that's something that's very important to keep in mind as I kind of run through this. So at any rate, that's how we got born. That's how I started this company up a few years ago. I bootstrapped it for the first 3 years. And this is the part where I tell you how great it is to be an entrepreneur and how much it can scare the willies out of you to be an entrepreneur. And I am among those who will say it's worth doing. But it does take a lot of fortitude, a lot of intestinal fortitude to really make it work. When you start any kind of company, it can be really, really tough, especially if you're bootstrapping, meaning you're only making whatever the company's making. Maybe you went from a really nice salary to no salary or something like that. And, it's one of those things I would encourage you to explore, but go into it with open eyes. One of the things, though, that I really learned when I became CEO and started my own company was that, I worked with CEOs like for a long time. I was like number two guy to these CEOs. I'd help them out with board meetings. I'd help them out with marketing campaigns. I'd help them out with messaging, you name it. What was interesting, though, I liken it to when I grew up, I flew in airplanes. I didn't get my pilot's license until later. But because I flew so much with my dad and my uncle, and when we were doing shop work and stuff like that, I kind of thought I knew how to fly, right? I'm sitting in the right seat and I'm like, yeah, I'm a pilot. I know what it is to fly. Well, it wasn't until I actually learned to fly and I took that aircraft off for my first solo and I'm like, I got to get this thing down on the ground. That's a whole different feeling than sitting there just watching somebody land the aircraft while you're sitting there looking for aircraft around you, looking for traffic. Being CEO is very similar. You think you know what it means to be a CEO, but until you're in that position where you're the person responsible for getting the funding, you're the person responsible for making sure that the company's moving forward, that you're getting your sales, that you're managing your employees. There's a whole lot to it. But again, what I will say is that everybody on this call is capable of becoming a CEO if they choose to go that route, capable of becoming an entrepreneur if they choose to go that route. Just go into it with open eyes when you do it, but it's a very exciting experience. So I'm going to shift a little bit from talking about the business, and I can take questions on that later if you like. But back to really one of my favorite subjects, which is industry advocacy and standards development. So ASTM, which is a standard, basically a compliance standard that is being developed. I'd encourage you to look it up. It's ASTM. The acronym basically means nothing, but it's where rules like light sport aircraft came from, which is a compliance standard, a consensus standard. It's built by the community and approved by the community, and then it may or may not be adopted by regulatory authorities as a means of compliance to be able to do different types of aircraft operations, et cetera. I got very much involved in that while this industry was maturing because we didn't have a lot of business to do. But there was a really good reason why it was important for me to be in it and why it's important for you to be in it in your career, which is, basically that you need to be involved in pushing where the regulations are going to go, pushing where the industry is going to go. And it gives you really good visibility into seeing what's being done, where you think things are going, so that you can determine if you agree with it or if you don't agree with it. Brent and I have been in many meetings where, we're at NBAA and maybe we think the committee's heading in the right direction, maybe we don't. And, we jump in there because we're helping drive, something down a path that we think it needs to go down. And again, I can talk about that later on. So moving along, one of the things, and I'll go to this too, is raising money and what that's like. I get asked that question quite a bit. So we're actually backed by Boeing and we're backed by Hearst Ventures, which are two large strategic investors. And then we have a lot of just traditional VCs. I will tell you that it is its own animal going out and raising money. You have to be passionate about what you're doing, that you have to know the right people, that you have to tell your story and you have to tell it well. I can tell you we did our last fundraise. I think we announced how much we raised. So I think that's out there, but we raised about 5 million. And I will tell you that I probably pitched to 70 or 80 VCs. And, before I got a bite on somebody to put money in, and that's actually the third round of funding that we had already taken. If you're going to go down that route, you want to get a whole bunch of advice. And I will tell you this, raising money is very hard. It's important to get the right investors because you don't want a jerk sitting at your board table. And I'll also tell you, it's really hard to fund hardware companies because VCs like software, they're like fast stuff that they can just scale up immediately. But it's also hard to raise money for aviation companies because regulations take longer than everybody thinks. Getting certified takes longer than everybody thinks, going through all those processes. And so VCs are very resistant to that. So it is, I might actually teach a class sometime about raising money for aviation companies because it's its own animal, but it can certainly be done. So, Brandon, am I doing okay? I've got just a few more things. All good?
Yeah. This is really well suited to one of the classes is looking at investment. The other is more connected on feasibility of operations in multi-domain. So if there's anything you guys are doing related to the ground handling environment with your maintenance operations, that might be beneficial, because one of the things I'm going to have them do is just strategize potential ways that they might recommend firms working in your field could look at MDO to build future opportunity.
Awesome. Well, I've got certainly a couple of observations I can make on that, but just a couple of things, wrapping this up, and then we can get on with whatever Brent's got planned next. But again, let me just say, I think you're probably in the most exciting generation in aerospace since the beginning. I know that sounds hokey, but I think it's even more exciting than the jet engine. You've got the new tech, which is revolutionizing aviation. You've got, of course, electric. Ultimately, we're going to have hydrogen. Beyond that, who knows what we're going to have as a power source. And, just to put it into context, I live in Utah, and I was at Utah Department of Transport thing where they're starting to do studies on, do they need to prepare for electric? Well, yes. Do they need to prepare for hydrogen? Yes. And I raised my hand and said, okay, so those things are cool and we're going to need them, but what about the other power sources we don't even know of yet? Because this is happening so fast that you have to prepare yourself and have that mental flexibility to know that whatever you're working on now is going to be basically, yesterday's technology overnight. And you have to be prepared for that. And that is something aviation mentality is not built for. The other thing that we're seeing that's really interesting, that I'm jealous of you guys where you're at in your career right now, is autonomy. We are seeing autonomy, increased autonomy. That's going to be a huge impact for you guys and gals out there as you look at what your career choices are going to be. Looking at autonomy, how that's going to impact the FAA, how it's going to impact future flight operations, that kind of thing. And really in both crewed and uncrewed aviation. And I would say that's one of the big things that you see too, is that what we're developing for crewed aviation bleeds over into the uncrewed and vice versa. And so, you're looking at all of aviation being revolutionized kind of at once. And so, bear that in mind. And as you look at what your future role can be, I mentioned this earlier, I'm going to mention it again because it's incredibly important. Everything we're talking about impacts every role in aerospace. Workforce development, Brent, I don't know how you're keeping up with it, but it is going ballistic on new ways to educate people as quickly as possible, but also to bring in more people. And that brings me to something that is near and dear to my heart, which is diversity and inclusion. I sit on the Advanced Aviation Advisory Committee with the FAA, and I will tell you that that is a topic that is of real interest to the FAA as part of their workforce development initiatives. It used to be, and I'll just speak a little generally here, so just bear with me, but aviation used to be more of a club. Let's just call it that you basically, maybe you were multi-generational in it, or maybe you knew somebody who was already in it. That's not going to work anymore because we need more and more people, and society is changing already to become more inclusive. So we as an industry, we have to keep up with that because we're already incredibly short of labor. We're going to need even more people because aviation is expanding through this, what is called the democratization of airspace, which is everybody gets access to the airspace. If you look at any advanced air mobility company, that's what they talk about all the time. They have to have everybody flying, which is really great. We want as many people to experience this as possible, and we therefore need it to be more inclusive. We need people who would not ordinarily see themselves in aviation to see themselves in aviation. And that means, little, school age kids. And I'm talking about, K through 6 kids and every kid need to be able to look out and see an aircraft flying over and say, I could do that. Or that looks really cool to me. I wonder how I get into that. Because right now we've got studies that show they're not to the level that we need them to. And again, that's something that with the AAAC, we're being very cognizant of. And I guess I'm going to leave you with, you as in the people that are on this call, this next generation of aerospace professionals, you're really the gateway for these people. You're going to be the one that expands their horizons. And in the long run, they're going to save your industry, and you're going to give them brand new opportunities that they wouldn't have been able to consider before. So with that, I've just put a whole lot in front of you. I appreciate you listening to me here, and happy to go wherever you want here, Brent.
So I want to just, I guess, make a couple clarifying remarks just for the class, because I think you brought up some amazing points here. One, you were talking about how we have to envision and have that foresight of, we can see what we're on the cutting edge of. We need to start to prepare for the things that we can't really even envision yet. And to both classes, this is where I want to say to you, this is where the research that you're doing in your coursework, this is where the skills, the knowledge that you pick up, that you are introduced to, that you practice and refine in your master's work becomes so essential. The case analysis that you do, where in the case of the 502 students, where you're looking at real world issues that are affecting the utilization of UAS and unmanned and uncrewed robotic system technology, this is where that feeds in. To the students in 501, where you're looking at new use cases and applications, it's through that detailed examination of what goes into the operational use that you start to see all the implications and considerations. And I know you hear me harp on those two terms in everything we do, in all our weekly discussions, in my feedback to you guys and all your activities. You always hear me say something about the implication or furthering the discussion related to the considerations, because they are so important. They are such a crucial element about what comes next. We have to be able to envision and view those spurious pathways where it may lead us down this way. And even if it doesn't, we still need to be prepared that if we do take a quick veer to the right, we have a way as an industry, as a field, to respond so that we can take advantage of it. From the business perspective, it'll create economic enterprise and opportunity. From the government perspective, it's a need to regulate to ensure safety is maintained. In the FAA speak, that would be equivalent level of safety, or ELOS. And then in the academia side, we're not always super slow to react. We may joke and say it's like trying to turn an aircraft carrier on a dime, but in many cases, we are at the forefront of that conversation. And so we are trying to take what is happening in the real world right now or tomorrow and incorporate that into the classroom. And that's why things like what we're doing here tonight with Brad in this discussion, this is so important, because it's bringing that forefront into our cooperative learning experience. So with that, I do have a couple questions for you, Brad, if you don't mind. I think these will help kind of, these are things that I tend to ask our guests to break some ice, but also to share with the students ways that they can think about addressing these same concerns, because they are tasked very much with examining a huge body of literature, understanding how to stay informed, and understanding how to just sort through the volume of information that you and I both know in many cases can be somewhat marketing speak, where it's rosy picture painted for all. This is going to be amazing technology that'll change change the world in 10 years. And it's always in 10 years we're going to get there. So I'd just like to ask you some questions that'll kind of help set that stage and maybe
Great.
tamp down
Excellent.
expectation. So personally, what tools or resources do you use to stay informed, and what challenges do you have to sift through that huge amount of stuff that's out there related to this?
Yeah, there's a lot out there. And so I've gotten to the point now where, I'm pretty much, I use a news aggregator that works out very well for me. And that allows me to kind of sift through the next generation aircraft news that I see coming in. So I use Feedly, which is a great one. That kind of puts it all in front of me, and I can sort and sift from there. I'll look at the newsletters. I get the newsletters that come in, and those are the industry type newsletters, and you see those kind of come and go. There's a few that have stuck around. And I'll subscribe to one if I see a new one and just see how it goes for me with that. And then of course, LinkedIn, Brent, I see you on LinkedIn all the time. I mean, that's a great professional tool. Twitter, I'm usually looking at cat videos or whatever on Twitter, but nonetheless, we'll get some good, news come up there as well. So, but LinkedIn is a great tool for being able to source through the news. You see all the announcements, and usually it's from people, friends or whatever that are doing stuff within the industry that's really exciting.
Excellent.
And it takes a lot of time. I spend a lot of time doing it, way too much.
I'm with you on that one. What are some of the pressing technological problems that you're seeing in the UAS world that we really need to start working like right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. We sell UAS capabilities, and I agree with a lot of what I hear that this technology can do. Nonetheless, it's still not as refined as we need it to be oftentimes for safety in the airspace. And, we can't just put something out that we think is going to work 75% of the times. I mean, that's the problem that we've had with trying to combine tech and aviation all along and I don't know how many times we've discussed this, Brent, but you've got the, tech culture of fail fast. Basically, when you're in technology, you want to build. If it doesn't work, you break it, and then you build it again, and you put a couple of different nuances on it, and then you do it over and over. You want to fail fast. Aviation, I can't think of a worse thing that you can do in aviation than fail fast. Usually, because when we fail, somebody, unfortunately gets hurt. And so, I think that we need to figure out how to refine that approach on product development. Maybe things like digital twins that can help. I think will get us going in the right direction towards that. But we're not at that point yet, in my opinion, where we're as fail-safe as we need to be in the airspace. And I don't think the general public has been conditioned to accept nothing less than, completely safe airspace. I mean, you're going to have some incidents, but they're few and far between. I mean, if you just look at the latest numbers on aviation safety, we've got this figured out, for the traditional stuff. So we need to figure out how to get us over, that level of safety over to this new technology we're talking about.
So what specific knowledge areas, any skills or abilities would you see being useful for those looking to enter the field to help them support their versatility and employability?
Yeah, great question. I think it depends. Go with what you enjoy doing. So that's what I tell everybody that I know that's figuring out their career. So if you like maintenance, then go do maintenance. If you want to, be more on the piloting side, then go do that. But the thing to have is what I was talking about earlier, is flexibility. And I'll give you a great example. So if you look in the future roles that I think that we're going to see, and one that I'm seeing developing already is, let's take an advanced aviation aircraft, so an eVTOL, and it's autonomous. Let's say this is 7 to 10 years from now. Nobody's piloting the thing, and you have somebody who takes the passengers out. So the ground handler is what we would call that person today. And they take them out and they load them into the aircraft, right? Well, somebody still has to release that aircraft for flight. Somebody's got to do some kind of walk around, because who knows who's flown into that or driven into that thing, who drove a tug into it, how did that aircraft get damaged? Make sure that the antennas are on and that the doors are shut correctly. Well, that's going to be kind of a new role. It's going to be somebody that's probably got some type of Part 65 certification that allows them to release an aircraft for operation. And so that's somebody who not only loads the passengers up, make sure the doors shut right, but walks around the aircraft and says, this aircraft is ready to fly. And it's done all the pre-ground checks and everything else. I hear a lot about autonomy, like you don't have to worry about it. The thing's going to power up and it's going to go through a self-check and it's going to know if it's ready to go or not. To a point, I agree with that. Where I don't agree with it, especially if you're talking about something carrying people, is that thing is still going to need a walk around, because I've worked a ramp. I've been out there. I've seen, accidents happen. I've seen ladders being left in places they shouldn't have been left. I've seen stuff being hooked up, just chocks in the wrong place. I mean, it's going to happen. So that's a new role that's going to exist. We believe, by the way, that's going to be a combined maintenance person and a ground operations person. So have that flexibility going into it. Think about what they're going to need, not what not what you perceive they're going to need, but think about what possibly they could need and be ready to fill that role.
Excellent. We have a couple, well, we have a chat question that I'll read off. That I know Lori has a question. If everybody else wants to start raising your hands, I'll call on you as close to order as I can get. Stephen asked, what's a good approximate percentage that operational drone companies should budget for maintenance? For example, many companies buy equipment for X, but never budget for Y.
Yeah. If only this were a drone problem. This trickles all the way back into traditional aerospace. It is hard to figure out what the operational costs are for an aircraft until you actually operate it. And with drones, we just don't have the data yet. And, when I initially started doing research for this company, I was looking at what is a reasonable cost. I think the easiest is probably to stick with like a 10% purchase price of the aircraft. And I got that from a Caravan page that I found. I can't remember where I found it. It was basically, it might have been a Cessna page, but at any rate, it basically gave you the 10% operating cost for a Cessna Caravan being operated for commercial purposes. But if you go to any one of the maintenance like industry groups I work with or anything and walk into the room and say, how much should I be budgeting for maintenance? They're going to look at you and say, who knows? We think we have an idea, but that's why I think 10% is probably the safest.
Outstanding. Lori, are you able to unmute and ask your question?
I can unmute. I really didn't have a question. It's just a comment when he was talking about financing and how they don't like airplanes. It doesn't surprise me. I told you my background's CPA, 30-something years. Same thing with trucking. Investors don't like assets that can move. So it's an added problem, and drones are going to be even more difficult because of their size. They're easier to hide as well as to move. And so investors like to know where those assets are when they invest the money in it. So I think it's an added level of it, an added layer because of what they are, because they are so movable and they're so easy to just relocate. So it was really more a comment than a question.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. I think with what you're talking about there too, you've got investors that buy assets and then have them operated or, lease them out or whatever. And then you've got investors that invest in companies that build a technology or something or a service. And so I think you're exactly right. That you do have exactly that issue. So I think that's a very relevant point. Thanks for bringing that up.
So Charles, before we get to your question, Thomas Talley had one, and this is going to be quite relevant. Brad, this is something that connects into discussions I think we've been having in emerging technology and just within professional circles. And it stems back to something we talked about years ago. So his question is, with respect to your serving on F-38, one of the committee scopes is minimum safety, performance, and flight proficiency requirements.
Yeah.
He's asking if he would be correct that flight proficiency requirement relates to the remote pilot certification. And if that's the case, has there been a discussion of expanding the RPC Airman Certificate standards to include a flight portion similar to what we see in crewed aircraft pilot certifications? Would that potentially include an RPC ecosystem of CFIs, designated pilot examiners, et cetera?
Yeah. I wish I had a better answer to that. Then I think that's kind of TBD. I'll tell you, the BV loss arc, for example, that's the beyond visual line of sight arc, met. Was that last year already? Time kind of flies. Yeah. But at any rate, they put out their report. And obviously the whole, pilot qualifications was a big piece of that, if you'll recall, Brent, and a contentious piece as well. Industry wants to make it as, I don't want to use the word dumb down, but they certainly want to make it as simple as possible. Lowest bar of entry, let's put it that way. And then you've got the other side where, people who've been around the block a few times know how badly things can go wrong. And you're a CFI. Okay. Okay, great. Are you going to be out of work? No. I think that there's going to be lots of opportunity. I think it's the same thing. You look at what the, requirements are, what the, what you do in that role, and then look at it in an autonomous environment. So, are you going to be somebody who's teaching pilots to monitor 5 different aircraft at once while they fly through different stages of flight? And if that's the case, then, what would you instruct a student to how to be able to operate in that environment? Like, what are the things that they need to be looking out for? How are they going to manage all those aircraft at once? Because that is where we will get, where you will have one pilot, many aircraft, and they'll just again be flying them through different critical stages of flight. And so, I think there will be certainly roles for instructors. What that's going to look like yet, not exactly sure. I think it'll probably be more akin to some of the work that we see going on in flight simulators, frankly. I hope I answered your question on that.
Hopefully this is working. My connection keeps on breaking up. Part of my concern is the transition from today to AI. I am somewhat skeptical that AI is really going to be fully mature in 10 years. And as you mentioned, the beyond visual line of sight working group, ACS, or not ACS, but the working group anyway, recommended doing, adding on a new rating for beyond visual line of sight, but it's only a written test. There's no practical exam. And that just seems risky. Again, we're not going to be, I don't see we're going to be full AI for at least a decade. So what do we do in the meantime? Are we putting the system at risk by not, having pilots, prospective remote pilots demonstrate their ability to actually perform, the pre-flight inspection, perform flight planning, everything that's going to be required for that beyond visual line of sight operation?
Yeah. Yeah, the proficiency, being able to demonstrate proficiency is again one of the things that constantly comes up, because we don't have that in 107. I think in 107, the FAA really did itself, in my mind, in the community, a disservice by not requiring some type of pilot proficiency training, testing. Same thing with airworthiness. I think they kind of shot themselves in the foot on the airworthiness side, because now the industry is kind of set that, well, we don't need to worry about demonstrating proficiency. We don't need to worry about continued airworthiness. And so now it's like we're having to bring them back and say, okay, listen, this worked okay for 107, but if we're going to get into other more complex operations, we're going to have to get much more akin to what we do in traditional aerospace to make sure that we're not, going outside of the safety parameters.
Thank you.
You bet. Great question.
Charles.
Hey, good evening, sir. I appreciate all the discussion. I had two questions, if you didn't mind. The first one sort of follows on with what we just talked about, which was, how has the recent FAA rulemaking on things like flight over persons, specifically with the categories requiring documented maintenance, affected your business? And second of all, when talking about financing and the difficulty, I was curious, what were your experiences with debt capital markets versus equity for the purposes of financing with an entrepreneurship?
Okay, so now you got me thinking out of two completely different parts of my brain here. So let's back up a second here and hit the first one. My company, while the regulatory capabilities are important, in other words, we can meet any regulatory, because our service centers work on everything from pistons all the way up through business jets already today. So they've got the regulatory acumen to be able to work on anything that is built that requires some type of regulation. As far or regulated maintenance, as far as has that led to some kind of an increase? I hate selling certificates. I hate selling that they have to use my services because they're required by the federal government. I like selling a quality system, and it's really all about the quality system. And so I've not seen any kind of huge increase because of any kind of requirement yet, probably for a couple of reasons. The first is, again, we're selling a quality management system. I've got customers that use us that are not required to use us by any regulatory authority. But also, no matter what you see in the media, we're not seeing that many of these aircraft flying yet. We're starting to see them pick up, but we're not seeing like huge numbers yet. And until you walk outside and you see a flying drone delivery, I think we're kind of in the aspirational stages, more of the where we're at from a reality standpoint today. So that's the first question. Did that answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you, sir.
Okay. And what was your second question?
I was basically going into, as an entrepreneur, what was your experience with with financing difficulties comparing debt versus equity? About a year ago, I actually was involved in a project down in Florida where we were trying to find financing for privatization of an airport down there for trade, and we were going into debt capital markets. And one of the things that was just so interesting was, it's a darned if you do, darned if you don't, with the either board members that have their say or a trustee for these bonds that is going to hang your feet over the fire.
Yeah.
Curious what your experiences were.
Well, I've never gone the debt route, so mine is all equity or equity debt. And what you end up with is a board, right? And you dilute yourself in your ownership, and it's all about getting the right valuation for what you're trying to sell, because that's basically what you're doing, is selling your company. And people think that because they're selling, equity in their company, that somehow, it's not their money anymore. And that's not the case at all. That's money that you've convinced people to spend to buy a piece of your company, and that's still your money. Now they have, through the board, their own recourse, their own ability to drive the direction of the company based upon if they're, if they're the majority or not. But nonetheless, that's still your cash that you basically earned through that. So haven't gone the debt route. Have thought about it a little bit. It works out well, I think, when you're talking about a situation like what you're talking about. I mean, I assume you're putting the airport up as basically as your collateral in that situation, right?
The situation in this was that the airport was probably worth less than than anything near a significant amount of the bonds, because the plan was to take a relatively small GA airport and upgrade it to the point of creating a commercial hub.
Okay.
Now, obviously, I'm no longer involved with the project. It wasn't going well when I left.
Yeah. Okay. And I assume, were they forming like a public-private partnership and ships around that as well?
Yes, they were using the Airport Improvement Partnership Program.
Yeah.
In order to try and.
Those things, yeah. And, those only work really if you can show some kind of value to the community or something to where they'll want to invest. At least that's what my experience has been, or it's seen. Because again, I've really never gotten into the debt thing. That sounds like a really interesting project, though.
Well, I appreciate your thoughts and feedback on it as well. Once again, I was the observer from the outside, not the person in the chair.
Okay. Probably a good place to be.
Excellent. Siobhan?
Hi, yes. In regards to the point you made about a difference in development concept from technology background, fail fast versus safety first from the aviation domain, what is the trend of spending resources from a company? Do they prioritize pushing new technology and sensory capabilities on platforms, or do they spend more resources on making sure the features are safe and reliable, or is it at the same level of priority?
I would say that's a great question. I mean, so basically you're asking, are they spending more on features or spending more on safety? Is that pretty much it?
Correct.
Yeah. So they do. It is all about features in the early stages in particular. Where I see it start to become more safety is whenever they start having issues with losing systems. And it's not the aircraft that are expensive, it's the payloads, or it's the damage done to reputation. And so if you start looking at drone delivery, nobody wants a smoking hole in their front yard with a big Amazon logo on it, right? That's not going to work out well for Amazon or whoever, Walmart, whoever's doing paying for that drone delivery. So as we see the proliferation of these aircraft, and more importantly, as we see the insurance companies start to get more involved in this, we're going to see an increase in the safety aspects and the continued airworthiness aspects. So again, I mentioned that a lot of these companies do not come from any type of traditional aerospace experience. And so they don't know how bad it can get in an aviation lawsuit. I will tell you that the last job I did before I left college and went into tech for my family's business was as a professional witness where there's an aircraft incident, and walked in to deliver a deposition, and it was me and the two attorneys that hired me an attorney representing the aircraft, an attorney representing the owner of the aircraft before that, the engine manufacturer, the aircraft manufacturer, the altimeter manufacturer, if that gives you a little hint as to what happened with that aircraft, the flight school, the school that it just went on and on. And we haven't seen, to my knowledge, that incident yet. And when we do, that's going to change the face of a lot of what we're dealing with. But it all comes down to, equivalent levels of safety and what is the risk? What is the relative risk, of these aircraft versus traditional aircraft? And that's what I think is going to probably change the perception when we start to see that and change the level of investment. But I kind of look at it in phases. I think it's probably the best way to put it, Siobhan.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've been extremely fortunate in that we've not had any major incidents yet in our field. Now we have a lot of mitigating technologies, but we've had a great time investment in terms of educating some of the new tech players into the market. And I mean, I know you've got a lot of experience with this, Brad, is, the folks that do come out with the software push, the new idea, the next gen technology, not necessarily FAA next gen, but the next generation, like i.e. Apple iPhone type technologies, where they want to hit the ground hard, fast, and what they don't have the experience with is that aviation professionalism, that safety culture, that element where we do see in the flight operations departments of many organizations, when you can see that model adopted into these tech firms, they can start to get a more realistic understanding of, this is how we comply with these safety requirements. This is how we prevent an ingestion of a drone into an airliner or a cargo aircraft, or should that situation occur, we have models that can kind of give us an understanding of how to better make these more frangible, or if they're flight over people, how to enable the selection of systems that will do the least harm should the system come down. We have a lot more information now at our fingertips due to groups like the FAA's Assure UAS Center of Excellence, the critical players and partners in that, the industry representatives and organizations that have data shared and have opened up the clear lines of support through whether it's their participation in things like the advisory committees like the DAC or other groups like what we do with MBAA, some of the AUVSI, and some of the other advocacy, and then finally groups like the FAA, the fast safety team. So
I will say, yeah, you're exactly right, Brent. And I will say, adding on top of that, you really do have to separate, even though I kind of put them into one category, much to people's annoyance, between drones and advanced air mobility. In advanced air mobility, because they're building an aircraft that is going to be carrying people, and because the overwhelming majority of them are going to be piloted with crewed pilot on board, they know they're building aircraft. They're just building a different kind of aircraft with autonomy as a target. But nonetheless, they are bringing in aviation people, and drawing, by the way, are draining them out of traditional aerospace. So we're losing people, leaders within industry organizations and companies in traditional aviation that are going into advanced air mobility, and they're doing it much more so than we see with the drone community. Though I am seeing companies like DroneUp, which is hiring very much aviation people and bringing them in, and really good ones. Andy Thurman, for example, I work with him on F-38, is an excellent example. And, that's somebody who's come from traditional aviation, spent a lot of time in the uncrewed aviation, and now he's working with Drone Up doing drone delivery stuff. So it's interesting to see how that's kind of morphed.
Hey, Manny, you have a question?
Hey, good evening. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I really appreciate the time that you spent thus far bringing us all together to have this conversation. I just really want to make a comment, and that was really, I looked at your website. Fantastic that you found a gap in an emerging technology, and you're leveraging that and connecting maintainers with operators, and very cool. I just wanted to mention it's very hard to not look at the parallels between how the electric vehicle market is currently moving with respect to autonomy and maintenance and power stations, etc. As I explored this discussion that we've had. So just a comment there. Thank you.
Well, it's a very relevant comment. I know that I work with 147 schools mainly in ASTM projects, because we're developing curriculum for things like drone technician qualifications, things like that. And they are looking at more of a Uber certification or at least training that includes marine, ground and air autonomous systems, and all the similarities between them, Manny. So that's a really good point. And you're starting to see a lot of technology move that way, to where maybe you graduate somebody that's got all the sensor, all the robotics, all the different types of autonomy training, and they can apply it to any one of these realms that they choose or specialize in a specific one. So it's going that path.
Awesome. I like that you mentioned sort of it's not about what is today, but what can be. I bring back sort of, I do a lot of listening to what is a podcast. So I listen to a lot of podcasts, and one of them talked about the automobile industry and moving ahead. And they use this analogy that at one point in time, there was a whole industry that worked around servicing, picking up horse dung in New York City. And at some point, all those folks that revolved around moving horse dung from the streets in the city had to evolve to service stations and gas stations. So progress, that's a good example.
Yeah, I'll bet one of those jobs was more enjoyable than the other two.
Yeah, sure.
They call it a step up.
Outstanding. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining tonight, as well as a big, tremendous thank you to Brad for sharing his perspective and thoughts regarding this exciting technology. It's been a very informative and enlightening session that hopefully has helped you to better understand UAS business development, as well as larger challenges that are affecting the field. Remember, to receive credit, you're going to need to develop a brief overview for the Module 6 discussion. For UNSY 501, identify that you are in attendance and describe how Brad's organization or how he personally discussed demonstrating feasibility of operations that help with future investment in the technology. And if you see any opportunity for the creation of new services or service providing in a similar vein. For UNSY 502, please describe how his organization could support or does support MDO, multi-domain operations, in ways that they might benefit from integration of such concepts if there wasn't one that was readily apparent. You probably will need to take a look at the RoboticSkies website. I've got that on a list of materials I'm going to drop in the discussion area tomorrow. You may have seen me typing away as everybody was talking, because I was trying to capture some of the different resources that Brad brought up. You're going to see just kind of that discussion of Boeing investment in his organization. I found a good story on that, as well as early FPV drone tech. Brad, when you were talking about your early experience, that brought to my mind the Fat Shark immersion FPV goggles with cloverleaf antenna. So that shows I was around and getting pretty immersed in that technology myself. When we had to build everything from the old manual transmitters, the old Futaba, some of the no names.
That's
But
right.
I've also got just some information regarding what disruptive technology is and how we see it in the UAS market. Just some information from NBAA regarding flight department and incorporation of UAS. That features, I believe, input from both you and I, Brad. It's from 2016, a little dated, but it will contextualize this. I'm also going to include some stuff on part 145, so you guys can get up to speed on that. F-38, and then I found a great website on some sample news aggregators if you want to adapt those as our guest has. So with that, thank you so much to everybody. And I'm going to stay on because I know one of my 502 groups had some questions. If anybody else has any questions for me regarding the class, please feel free to stay on.
Well, thanks for the great questions.
Thanks, Brad.
Appreciate it, Brent. We'll see you.
See ya. Have a good night.
You too.